This is Hemant Mehta for the Friendly Atheist podcast. Jessica is out this week, so it's just me, but I have an interview you're going to really, really like. And if you like what you're listening to, please go to patreon.com/friendlyatheistpodcast. Kristin Kobes Du Mez is a professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. I wanted to chat with her because all of those interests are right up our alley on this podcast, and a book she released last year has become wildly successful for maybe all the wrong reasons. And I mean that in the best possible way because it really articulates what we've all witnessed over the past several years. It's a New York Times bestseller called Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. It attempts to explain why white evangelicals overwhelmingly supported Donald Trump despite all the non-Trumpy values they claimed to hold dear before he came along, by looking at the history of evangelical culture. I want to read you just one passage so you get a sense of this book. By the time Trump arrived proclaiming himself their savior, conservative white evangelicals had already traded a faith that privileges humility and elevates the least of these for one that derides gentleness as the province of wusses. Rather than turning the other cheek, they'd resolved to defend their faith and their nation, secure in the knowledge that the ends justified the means. Having replaced the Jesus of the Gospels with the vengeful warrior Christ, it's no wonder many came to think of Trump in the same way. In 2016, many observers were stunned at evangelicals' apparent betrayal of their own values. In reality, evangelicals did not cast their vote despite their beliefs, but because of them. It's a fantastic book, and in this conversation, we talked about whether white evangelicals corrupted their faith or had their faith exposed for what it really was, whether the religion is a force for good, her advice to pastors looking to fix toxic masculinity, skinny jeans, and so much more. Kristin, thank you so much for doing this. For the people who haven't read your book or aren't familiar with your work, can you give us a brief synopsis of why you wanted to write this particular book?
Yeah, essentially, Jesus and John Wayne is a history of white evangelical masculinity and militarism. And it traces this through the last half century or so of American history. And I wanted to write the book because more than 15 years ago, I began to explore this connection. And I was drawn to the topic through my students. I teach at a Christian university, and some students in my class, after I'd lectured on Teddy Roosevelt, to show them how masculinity worked in history, how it was linked to race and to empire, and in some cases to violence. They came up to me and said, "Professor Du Mez, there's this book that you have to read." And it was a best-selling Christian book at the time, John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. Went on to sell millions of copies. And when I opened the book, I saw what they were talking about. It was a very militant conception of quote-unquote Christian manhood. And I had an inkling that this was the early 2000s, right around the time of the Iraq War. I had an inkling that it was maybe functioning in a similar way as what I just taught them about Teddy Roosevelt's era. And then I set the book aside, the project, for a long time, in part because I wasn't quite able to tease out how mainstream this was and how fringe, because what I was uncovering in my research seemed really extremist. And I had other projects going on. And it actually wasn't until the days after the Access Hollywood tape released in 2016 that I realized that the language I was hearing so many white evangelicals use to support Donald Trump, to defend their support for Donald Trump, was strikingly similar to the rhetoric that I had encountered years before, around these conversations of what does it mean to be a Christian man. It was a warrior masculinity, do what needs to be done. Just like Donald Trump, they were saying was their ultimate fighting champion. And it was then that I knew that there was a longer history here. And I knew when I was hearing pundits say that this was somehow support for Trump was a betrayal of evangelical values, that wasn't getting the story right.
So the interesting thing to me that you said there is you were hesitant to write it because you thought at first it might be too fringy until you realized, no, this is kind of front and center. So the subtitle of your book is, how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. And I know a thought that I've had a lot is, did they corrupt the faith or did guys like Donald Trump expose the faith for what a lot of critics, myself included, have argued that it always has been? And I mean, what's your take on that?
Oh, yeah. No, that line I gave a lot of thought to. The subtitle was really hard to come up with. It took us months. And part of the problem was this is a trade book. And I've always considered it my book on white evangelical masculinity and militarism. And at some point in the process, we were told that both masculinity and militarism were too long. We couldn't use them. And so we had to get creative. It really came down to why does this book matter and for whom? And that's how I ended up. I want to be very clear. Corrupted a faith is not a historical claim. I'm upfront about that. And that's why I was nervous about making you can't make that claim historically speaking for the reasons that you suggest. But I was thinking, who needs this book? I think it's important for evangelicals themselves. And in that part, I'm speaking to them on their own terms. These are quote unquote Bible believing Christians. And yet, what I show is that they are willing to toss aside whole sections of the Christian scriptures, teachings of Jesus, to love your neighbor, to turn the other cheek, the Beatitudes, the fruit of the Spirit, right? They're just very comfortable. They're reworking the historical doctrine of the Trinity in order to bolster their patriarchal beliefs. So that part is saying on your own terms here, take a close look. And then the other part of the subtitle, Fractured a Nation, it matters for all of us, not just evangelicals.
One of the complaints, and I do want to get into some of the complaints I've seen, but one of the complaints I've heard is that, you, by focusing on guys who are very masculine and patriarchal, are you cherry picking people like Mark Driscoll, the very alpha male type of figures, or do guys like him do they fairly represent this strain of conservative Christianity? Because obviously, those alpha male types are in every religious tradition and every non-religious tradition. They exist. So is a guy like that, or any number of them that you mention, how representative are they of this brand of conservative evangelical Christianity?
Yeah, well, first, let me say that my original draft of this manuscript was 60,000 words longer. So if there's cherry picking, there are a lot of cherries to pick. And then I mean, this is a question that I ask explicitly through this book, and I do so, in early on with figures like Bill Gothard and James Dobson. I do it later with people like Driscoll. I mean, yes, Driscoll is. He's not the norm. And yet he was incredibly popular, making all of the, most influential evangelical lists. So what I tried to do is look at evangelicalism as a system of networks, alliances, and looking at affinities. And so you take somebody like Driscoll or somebody like Doug Wilson and other, absolutely extremists. I say that over and over again. Like, he would not identify as mainstream evangelical. He'd be offended at the thought. And yet we see him platformed by people like John Piper. We see him in the pages of Christianity Today. That's what I'm getting at. In my chapter on James Dobson, who I would suggest, if you're telling the history of the last half century of American evangelicalism, James Dobson has to be at or near the center. And then I show how I pair him with Bill Gothard, who also just hands down extreme fringe. And yet he influenced millions of people directly. And then when I show his ideas of hierarchy, of patriarchal authority, of his kind of foundations, his hierarchical understanding of how society works and how it ought to work, and then you set it alongside the teachings of an irrefutably mainstream figure like James Dobson, you see not a lot separates these two. And that's really what I'm trying to tease out. So where are the affinities? Who's giving cover to whom? And, I say in the book that essentially this militant masculinity is a dominant strain. And I thought very carefully about that. It's not the only evangelicalism. Not at all. But you are going to bump up against this in evangelical institutions, this more militant, conservative, patriarchal, in organizations. And then the question is, what's going to win out? So this isn't all evangelicals, but it is a dominant strand.
Is there something strange about the fact that I'm making this question up, so I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there was an article in Christianity Today, or maybe the New York Times, that basically said a lot of white evangelical pastors freely admit that a large percentage of their churches include the MAGA types, which they fully admit contradicts the teaching of Jesus, but they're almost too afraid to address it, or they think by not addressing it and staying apolitical, that's the best move for them, as opposed to going in the other direction and then they get known as some political preacher. Like, let me get to the question I really want to ask, which is, like, how much blame should we place on moderate Christians or magazines like Christianity Today for platforming those names and for not calling out the bad behavior? Because believe me, I've heard it from atheists plenty of times who want to condemn moderate religious views for not condemning the extremists. But I don't know if that's the same argument to make in this part of the world, in the evangelical world.
Yeah, so I push back against those who want to starkly separate the fringe, the more extremist views from the more mainstream, because there's been a lot of talking about kind of the hijacking of evangelicalism by conservative politics or by this MAGA, and that's really not what history shows us. And there has been the evangelicals were building the moral majority from the ground up. They were shaping Republican politics. They were, you look at relationship with Fox News or with talk radio, and they were right there at the ground level. They were the audience, and they helped shape all of this. So this is not a hijacking. I want to make that very clear. And then there's also we can't draw a super stark distinction between kind of this popular or populist evangelicalism and pastors. In some cases, yeah, and these are the pastors who are going to be interviewed in these think pieces, and these are the ones who, when they do end up speaking out, end up losing their pulpits, or they feel like their hands are tied, they are conflicted. There are also many pastors in evangelical pulpits who are fully immersed in this world, and they are consuming this popular culture, and they are contributing to it. And that's where I think we need to look at not just an institution like Christianity Today, which is kind of flagship, respectable, elite evangelicalism. We have to look at something like the Gospel Coalition. We have to look at John Piper's Desiring God. We have to look in these spaces as well, and then see how they have defined Christianity, how they have defined orthodoxy, how they have centered things like a pretty strict patriarchy at the center of their definitions of orthodoxy. And then you can see how they did start to decide who is with us and who is against us. And that's where I think that we really need to focus our attention. And then these lines really do get blurred, and we can start talking, I think, in more honest ways about complicity here.
It's interesting, every time I see a Franklin Graham Facebook post that makes me cringe or something, the thing that's even scarier than that is the number of times it's been shared at that point.
Incredibly popular figure, right? And so then you have some of these, more respectable types, if you will, who for a long time have wanted to say, yeah, that's not real evangelicalism, right? That's not really who we are. And that's one thing that my book does, is it pushes against that, desire to separate out the true evangelicals, who are the more respectable, moderate ones, who happen to also be the ones who up until now have largely been writing the histories of evangelicalism, have been the ones who have been defining who is a real evangelical. And that's what what this book does is it says no. We have to take evangelicals for who they are, how people are self-identifying as evangelical, and then it is a more problematic story.
How much of that is the no true Scotsman? Like, I don't like Mark Driscoll. He's not really an evangelical. He's not really a Christian. I mean, at this point, what is the definition? I mean, I know there's an academic definition of evangelicalism and the quadrilateral and whatnot, but at this point, I mean, who really gets to define who they are? I mean, because if there's an academic definition that centers around Jesus and the crucifixion, but in practice, if you ask outside the evangelical bubble, what does evangelical Christianity stand for? You're going to get a very different definition. At this point, I mean, I guess what would your definition be of what an evangelical is? And I mean, is there a discrepancy between that definition and how you think everyone else sees it?
Yeah. I mean, well, not everyone else. I do in this book push back against evangelicals, evangelical leaders, let me say, who insist on defining evangelicalism according to theological beliefs, this quadrilateral that you're referring to, which basically means a 4-part definition or list of distinctives. So biblicism, the authority of the scriptures; crucicentrism, the centrality of Christ, Christ's atonement; conversionism, this born again experience; and activism or evangelism, so acting out of these beliefs. That's what historians have used. That's what you go to the website of the National Association of Evangelicals, they'll say this is what it is to be an evangelical. There's a lot of problems with that. I'll just name a few. I mean, if you look at surveys that evangelicals themselves do, you'll see incredibly high levels of theological illiteracy among self-professed church-attending evangelicals. Right there, I say, so is theology really central? And then you can bring race into this. The vast majority of Black Protestants in the United States can check off those boxes. The vast majority of those do not identify as evangelical because they know there's a whole lot more to being evangelical than just checking off a rubric. And that's where, for me as a cultural historian, I pay attention. So what is evangelicalism? And it's not that theology doesn't enter into the conversation at all, but I don't make it primary. And instead I look at evangelicalism as a historical and cultural movement. And that's where race comes to the fore. It is predominantly, as it has come to take shape, it is a white religious movement. And it is, again, I see it as a consumer culture as much as anything else. So are you an evangelical or not? Well, have you shopped at Christian bookstores in your life? Do you read Christian publishing? Do you listen to Christian radio? Do you listen to Christian music? Now, for many of your listeners, this might not immediately resonate. For anybody who has spent any time in an evangelical community, immediately you're going to start finding all these points of connection. We know the same artists. We've read the same books. We've done the same book studies. And this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. There's so much money here. And it is a subculture. And it's largely invisible to people outside of that world, but to people inside, many people have been wholly immersed in it. So for me, I'm more interested in not are you a real or a fake evangelical, and who gets to define that? I'm interested in how immersed have you been in this evangelical consumer culture, the system of networks, alliances, right, distribution networks, and so on. How shaped have you been? And then let's take that popular culture very seriously and see what sorts of values are being transmitted, what ideas are allowed and not, how are the boundaries defined within that consumer culture.
I'm wondering, as you've been making this case through your book, through lectures, things like that, I would assume a lot of your students, even at Calvin University, are pretty receptive to those ideas. I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong. I wonder if they are more or less receptive to it than some of your academic colleagues who might be older. I mean, is there a difference in how people have taken your ideas here?
Yeah, I would say it's not so much an age difference as, in fact, in this case, the younger generation would have slightly less of an exposure to this subculture because I think it's been breaking down just a little bit with, social media and things like Netflix and so on. We have more access. You have to be pretty isolated in a really conservative corner of this world, like homeschool culture. So to stay kind of, separate, whereas in the 1990s and early 2000s, it was a lot easier to pretty much just exist in this world if you wanted to, or if your parents wanted you to. So I think that's changed. But yeah, I think that historians who have been trained in intellectual and religious history, many of whom may have gone to seminary, who identify as, the more respectable intellectual evangelicals, that's where I got some pushback. I think more pushback early on. Whereas with popular ordinary evangelicals, right? Just not scholars, not leaders, just ordinary
They go to
folks.
church, they believe.
They go to Bible study. Those are the people who are the book's biggest fans. And I have to admit, I was not expecting that when I wrote this book. I kind of thought it was, evangelicals. I thought some would read it. I did not realize that they would be the book's biggest fans, biggest proselytizers. Since the book has come out, I've received well over 1,000 messages from readers, probably close to 2,000 now. I can't keep up. I can't answer them all. Almost all of them say some version of, "This is the story of my life, and thank you for helping me to see."
One of the criticisms, I wonder, and this is like conservative reflex, I think, the argument is by writing a book like this, you are suggesting white evangelicals are uniquely bad when it comes to toxic masculinity and that problem. But that's really just a problem with American culture at large, or maybe all of humanity. How much of this is unique to American evangelicalism, and how do you separate what's going on in that subculture versus the broader culture?
Oh, it's not unique. Although the shape it takes is somewhat unique. I would say that much. What they do with it can be, I don't know if unique is quite the right word, but distinctive. And so one of the points that I try to make through the book, and this is getting to the title, Jesus and John Wayne, is the interplay between secular conservatism and conservative evangelicalism, right? And that's this figure of John Wayne. Or even when I was reading these early books, 15 some years ago on Christian manhood, what I saw immediately was there wasn't a lot of scriptural interpretation in these books. There weren't even a lot of Bible verses in these books. Instead, authors were looking to Hollywood heroes, to people like Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart as their model of Christian manhood. They were looking at mythical.
Mark Driscoll.
Right. Mark Driscoll loved William Wallace. Not the real William Wallace, mind you, but Mel Gibson's William Wallace. Right? This was in yes, John Wayne was popping up, and Teddy Roosevelt, and mythical warriors and heroes and soldiers, and General Patton and MacArthur, and sometimes General Lee, and Confederate heroes. And so, yes, this was a pattern that I saw. And in this too, for evangelicals who have largely defined themselves in opposition to quote unquote secularism, right? To show them just how much of their quote unquote biblical or Christian teachings were reflecting these broader cultural allegiances. And in the case of this masculinity, Cold War models of masculinity and post-civil rights, post-feminism, a kind of reactionary white masculinity that they then essentially baptized and combined with some theological teachings, created this tradition of Christian manhood, which, this is my critique, wouldn't necessarily align with the teachings of Christ as have historically been interpreted by most Christians, and in turn then haven't just kind of warped Christian masculinity, but have fundamentally warped some pretty basic teachings of Christianity itself.
I wonder, because it came out recently, what you made of the Jerry Falwell Jr. comeback tour that appeared in Vanity Fair. Did that strike? I mean, because he's been out of the spotlight for a while, but he very much tried to exemplify that alpha male type of caricature. on campus at Liberty. What were your thoughts to him trying to explain that he was almost playing a role? It wasn't really about religion for him as much as it was building up Liberty.
Yeah. So this is a terrible confession here. I have not yet read the Vanity. Obviously I've read all about it. I've seen it,
Right.
But on my feed. And I thought, do I have to? I know I have. Do I really have to? I have read more about Jerry Falwell, and a lot about Jerry Falwell, different parts of Jerry Falwell that I would ever want to. So I did kind of think I'll get back to that. So I'm
That's okay.
secondhand here. I know the gist of it. But I think that it's revealing. It's not surprising. What needs to be interrogated more isn't Jerry Falwell. It is evangelicals' love of figures like Jerry Falwell. And now he's crossed so many lines that he's maybe not the best example anymore. He is a pretty extreme example. But evangelical willingness to forgive all sorts of sins of certain people, of powerful white conservative men, and yet to be rather ruthless in kind of holding to judgment many other folks. So I think that's certainly a pattern that I explored in my book, and the treatment of Jerry Falwell Jr. would fit with that up to a point, but he's again crossed so many lines that it's hard to draw too many broader conclusions about him at this point.
This is a point I've tried to make in the past, which is George W. Bush was very much, he wore his religion on his sleeve, kind of the height of conservative Christianity at one point. But I feel like with Barack Obama and so many other broader trends, there was such a backlash to that merging of conservative Christianity and politics. And I wonder, because I haven't seen it yet, but Trump was, and the merging of him with conservative Christianity seems so much bigger, so much more harmful, in my opinion. Do you see a bigger backlash coming in the future, or have we not seen that yet? And what does that mean for Christianity? I mean, part of me hopes that so many younger Christians, especially, would see how bad both of those groups were, especially when together, that they would want to fight back against it. And we've seen surveys showing a move away from organized religious labels. Mm-hmm. But I don't know historically if you're seeing a trend or a bigger backlash down the road coming, or if this is, I hate to use this phrase, but the new normal for what that world is.
It's so hard to predict the future. I say that as a historian who we're constantly surprised by what's right around the corner. It's hard to see. But let me say a few things about what I'm kind of looking at to figure things out. George W. Bush is an interesting case because he came in under compassionate conservatism, and then 9/11 happened, and then he comes out as the crusader, right? Remember that? And then very quickly it's told, no, you can't say that. That's problematic here. And then he self-corrected some, but evangelicals still, took that and ran with it, this kind of crusade, and that's where we have this alarming trend of Islamophobia, and which hasn't really disappeared to this day, but and then the militarism, preemptive war, and so on, that takes hold. But George W. Bush's fate is a little different, and it fits with the patterns that we've seen before up until Trump. And that is when a Republican and when a conservative Christian even is, in the case of Bush, is in the White House, it becomes hard for conservative evangelicals to raise money, to kind of rally the troops. You see a lot of their organizations go bankrupt during, the Reagan years. You kind of see this, and then Clinton comes in, and yes, we have the opposition, right? It's this embattlement that works really well to raise money and to mobilize voters. Over the course of Bush's presidency, we see as things aren't going that well in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, we see that he doesn't look like the warrior president. He doesn't look like the cowboy president we had thought he was going to be. And yeah, I don't know about this guy so much. And so we see the same kind of attrition happening. Barack Obama was a kind of godsend there. Not only is he an African-American president, he's a Democrat, he's a quote unquote liberal. And then we have also the sea change in LGBTQ rights. And all of a sudden there, aha. And that's not just a kind of organic response, a natural response. This is evangelical leaders had seen those that polling data. They had seen that young white evangelicals in particular, were defecting. They voted for Obama in 2008. Not a lot of them, but enough of them to cause great concern. So they doubled down and absolutely opposed him at every turn. And it was their goal to pull those young evangelicals back into the fold. Then you had the Obergefell decision, threats to religious liberty as they perceived it, and it just totally played into their hands. Then we get Trump, right? We can see this kind of backlash there against Obama, very obviously. But what Trump did, which is different than any Republican before, is he was able to maintain this sense of peril, of threat, of urgency every single day, even though their great protector, was in the White House and had all of this power. We saw how he did it.
He gets to perpetuate victimhood even while he's in power.
Absolutely. And so I feel like that has changed the equation so much so that I don't know what comes next. I don't know what's around the corner.
If you're like me, you spend way too much time thinking about what to eat for dinner and not nearly enough time preparing for podcasts or writing blog posts. But HelloFresh can fix that problem, even if you're a vegetarian like me. HelloFresh delivers pre-portioned ingredients to your door, including farm-fresh produce that arrives within a week, so you get convenience and quality. No grocery store, no lines, no excess food that sits in your fridge for weeks on end, and there's plenty of room to customize your plans as needed when it comes to delivery day, meal sizes, or food preferences. HelloFresh offers 50 menu and market items each week, including veggie, calorie smart, family friendly, and gourmet options. It's everything from hibachi sweet soy bavette steak and shrimp to white cheddar wonder burgers. Go to HelloFresh.com/friendlyatheist16 and use code friendlyatheist16 for up to 16 free meals and 3 free gifts. HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. It seems like Roe v. Wade is on the verge of being officially overturned. I mean, strategically speaking, for evangelicals here, is that a good or bad thing for them? Because, like you just said, it's a lot easier to raise money and to call yourself a victim when it's the law and say, we're trying to overturn it, give us money to do it. And even though their end goal is we want to overturn that law, let's say the Supreme Court does exactly what they've been planning on them doing for a long time. What happens on that issue? Do they just move on to let's fight trans people now, or as their main goal? Or do they, I mean, is that strategically, is that a good or bad thing for them? I'm sure they'll celebrate, but.
Yeah. No, really good question. First of all, right, Roe v. Wade would just, if it gets overturned, it moves this to the states. So then we have 50 times the battles. And so it's not going anywhere anytime soon. A few years back, I might have thought, that would take a lot of kind of momentum away from the religious right. I don't think that's the case at all anymore. And in fact, there's plenty of survey data that suggests that for all of the attention that abortion gets as this mobilizing political issue, survey data doesn't really bear that out. It's surprising that if you ask evangelicals to rank, the order of significance of a number of issues, abortion comes in somewhere behind foreign policy and the economy. And at the same time, as somebody who moves in these spaces, that doesn't quite ring true to me either. Because abortion still, for so many people will tell me it is the most important thing. I think it is an important issue primarily because it gives a kind of moral veneer to the entire package. But it is just one facet of of evangelical politics. Right there, they have as strong feelings, if not stronger feelings, on a whole range of issues, from immigration, border walls, law enforcement, Black Lives Matter. I mean, you can just, tax policy, all of these things. And so at this point, sure, you could remove abortion, wave a magic wand as if it had never happened. And I don't see many evangelicals at all shifting certainly not their party affiliation. Plus, there's going to be this gratitude, like you finally did it. Thank you, Republican Party. And still, even if you remove abortion entirely, there's this whole other constellation of issues that they continue to hold fast to. And that's why, too, when you look at evangelicals and their support for Trump, there was a very tight match when it came to policy agreement as well. This wasn't just, there wasn't a lot of holding our noses.
One of the critics, I wanted to know if you had a response to. I don't know if you read all the reviews of the book. I mean, I would if I were in your position because I'm genuinely curious.
I read a lot, but there's a lot out there.
I'm sure.
Go for it.
Well, yeah. So one person said you're blaming toxic masculinity for this white evangelical preference for Trump, or at least you're attributing that as a large reason they like Trump, not their theological or ethical beliefs, which means, they said, you're not grappling with the idea that Trump ran as a pro-life candidate and he lived up to his campaign promises on that score. I'm wondering if you have a response to that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'd go back and say, if white evangelicals hadn't supported Donald Trump already in 2015 and certainly early 2016, he would not have secured the nomination. So if you go back in real time, we see this grassroots support for Donald Trump manifesting already in August of 2015 when no evangelical leaders were supporting him. It wasn't until January of 2016 that we have Falwell Jr. and Robert Jeffress coming out and endorsing Trump, essentially endorsing.
Right.
And then it took months for other evangelical leaders to fall in line. But you saw this popular support among white evangelicals drawn to him. And you saw this debate. And yes, you can point to some early, primary data and say that still the majority of evangelicals preferred other candidates. But we're moving more towards plurality. And Donald Trump was showing strong. But early on, there was a lot of uncertainty about Trump. Who was this guy? What were his views on abortion? Wasn't he recently a Democrat? Who is this guy? As he made himself known, particularly on the debate platform against other Republican primary opponents, we saw evangelicals starting to embrace him again, not top down. They still preferred Rubio or Cruz, but from the bottom up increasingly. And so that's what I would point to. And then this idea of, hey, he was the best candidate, right? What choice did we have? He was up against Hillary Clinton. Okay, even if we start there, then in this holding our noses idea, I watched extremely closely after the election, the weeks, the months, and then the years. I saw zero buyer's remorse. And I saw zero attempt to say, okay, thanks, right, we dodged the Hillary Clinton bullet. Now we have Donald Trump. Let's temper him. Let's critique this. Like, the only voices who were critiquing him from the evangelical fold were the Never Trumpers who had opposed him from the beginning. So again, I just look at that. And then you have to ask, how long can you maintain that this is a betrayal of evangelical values until we have to start to ask, wait a minute, what are those values? When we talk family values, what are we really talking about here? And that's when we see, in the book, I make some pretty strong claims there that fundamentally it's about sex and power, and it's about white patriarchal power. And if you agree with that, then we're not talking about betrayal anymore. We're talking about some consistency that helps explain this enduring loyalty.
I don't know if this is a fair question, but let's put you on the spot. I mean, at this point, because you travel in these circles, you are in these circles. I mean, is evangelical Christianity a force for good? And you only get a yes or no answer. That's there's no nuance there. But yeah, I mean, at this point, obviously evangelicals think they're a force for good. They have a moral standard that they claim that they're promoting. But your whole point of the book and a lot of things you're saying is the harm that they have caused and the separation it is from what Jesus taught. Like, so how do you answer that? Are they a force for good?
So a lot of people, critics want me to say, okay, sure. There's some bad stuff here. Can't argue. It's all, we've got the footnotes, we've got the sources, but didn't these guys do some good things too? Come on,
right.
How about the good things that these guys did? And plus they shared the gospel, right? And isn't that what really matters? And sure, we could, other books have been written. There are plenty of books that are highlighting, the nicer side of evangelicalism. For me, it's not one or the other. And this is really important. It is both. And so how do we understand evangelicals who do give a lot to charity? Evangelicals who are showing up at our soup kitchens? Evangelicals who, if they're your neighbor, they're genuinely nice people to you, right? Hopefully.
Right.
Chances are, hopefully. Right. All of this stuff, this kinder, gentler version of evangelicalism, it exists alongside this harsher, authoritarian, patriarchal evangelicalism. The two go hand in hand. We've got Mike Pence serving the interests of Donald Trump. That is how this works, right? And so, sure, let's talk about the nice stuff that they're doing. And then let's ask the follow-up question, and how can they also be doing this? And then what we're going to see is some of this good stuff does end up providing a moral cover for some of the deeply harmful things that they are doing to their neighbors, to their fellow Americans. And frankly, as I researched this book, I was not expecting when I started this project, but certainly by the time I was halfway through, I realized just how authoritarian many of these teachings are. And I started to be increasingly concerned about the fate of American democracy. And I think that's where I would, it sounds kind of extreme, not anymore. It doesn't sound extreme. As I was writing, I thought, is this really where this is going? What do I do with this? And so, yes, this kinder, gentler Christianity is intertwined with this authoritarianism, and that's the harm in it. And that's why it is so popular, and that is why it is so hard to combat.
Are you familiar with all the YouTubers and TikTokers, like especially a lot of young women, young evangelical couples who promote the very strain of patriarchal conservative Christianity? I'm so curious if you watch those videos, what your thoughts are when you see them. Like, they're the subject of so much hate watching. the stay pure and then have the best sex ever on your wedding night. Exactly.
The TikTok. So maybe my next book is on it's a cultural history of white Christian womanhood, looking at some of these spaces. And it's going to cover some of this. It's called Live, Laugh, Love. That should give you a sense. Unfortunately, yes, it is my job to do this, although I've got a couple of amazing research assistants who are younger than I am, and I'm handing this to them. They're giving me some of the highlights, but that's a
you need links. You let me know.
Thank
Great.
you.
So, okay, let's suppose a evangelical pastor comes up to you, megachurch pastor, says, I agree with your premise here. I hate the fact that my religion has been taken over by what I think are these extremists who share the same faith I do. What advice do you give them at this point?
This isn't a hypothetical. I get asked this every week.
That makes me feel good. That's nice.
No, right? So that's one thing that this book has opened up to me, the reception of this book among evangelicals themselves, including conservative white evangelical men, including complementarian men, right, who hold to this a kind of patriarchy. But when they read this book, they say, oh, not right. It did go too far. This is not biblical. There's all these cultural layers, and we can see now what, and so they're actually using this book to go back to the scriptures and say, what are the limits here? What is biblical? What are biblical gender roles and stuff? So there's a lot of that. And I do think that's worth pointing out. But when pastors come to me, disclaimer, I'm a historian. So I'm really good at looking at what has happened and then explaining it and the repercussions and how to understand it. I'm now in an unusual place where I get asked this question a lot. What should we be doing instead? And at first I wanted to say, I don't know. I mean, good luck with that, right? That's not really my thing. I can just tell you what has happened. But I realized that, hey, if I'm going to be asked, and these are people who have a lot of power, I better come up with some answers. So what I try to do is have them think about their own participation in this, to see how, even though they are now seeing how bad things are, seeing the dangers in some of the ideas that they have been immersed in, I want them to be to take a careful look at the ways in which they have promoted these ideas. Even if they're jumping off the train at this point, they were driving it for a long time. And I think that introspection, I'm actually seeing a lot of that among the lesser known figures, whereas some of the more powerful national figures, with the exception of Beth Moore, I think, who's been much more introspective on this and self-critical. I think that there's more work to be done.
Who left the Southern Baptists on an official basis.
And has acknowledged her own complicity in promoting some of the ideas that brought us to this point. And she's paid a cost for calling him out when she has. So that's one thing I try to do. I also, talk with these folks about who they have excluded from their fellowship, to use a Christian word, from their company, who they have actively excluded, how they have drawn these lines around orthodoxy, and to think, about particularly racial dynamics, issues of LGBTQ, and to think about what it looks like to make amends. And then sometimes depending on who's talking to me, I'll ask, if I sense like there's a huge sense to rush to kind of fix things. Oh my gosh, what have we done? How can I fix it? And putting themselves right out in front. Sometimes I think some of these evangelical leaders maybe need to wrestle with, I'm super grateful for that instinct, that impulse, but is this yours to fix? Are you the leader here? I mean, by all means, use the power that you have, but to remind some of these folks who feel like they need to save Christianity because their corner of it is looking so awful right now, to remind them that, if you are a Christian, white evangelicalism isn't the only Christianity there is. And maybe your job is to go find some of those spaces where Christianity is less problematic, where it may be flourishing, and those may not be in your white middle-class suburbs. And then maybe your job for a while is just to listen and to learn, and maybe not get right out in front of the next, big fix and, start a podcast or something. But it's hard. It's hard because there's a lot of, you want to work with the goodwill that is there. You want to use the people who have authority in these spaces. But there is a lot of reckoning, I think, that has to be done. And I think that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of humility.
I have a couple more serious questions, but this one came to me at 2 a.m. and it sounded good. And now I'm reading it and I'm like, this is a dumb question. But how come, like, the stereotypical evangelical, white evangelical Christianity that you're writing about focuses on this manly, patriarchal, alpha male type, but also the stereotype applies to like hipster, skinny jean, quote unquote, effeminate pastors too? Are those two different things, or are they converging on the same place? Because they kind of preach a lot of the same stuff.
Yeah, I wanted to have, originally when I proposed this book, I was going to have a chapter on alternate evangelical masculinities, because there's a lot of them out there. They don't all fit into this. But they do come down to a kind of power, right? So, kind of masculine power. What does that look like? And you can kind of see it morph and shift over time. In the 1990s, you had this softer, gentler patriarchy with the Promise Keepers movement. That was actually a really interesting moment in evangelical history. Post-Cold War, everything seemed up for grabs, and it seemed like we might be taking a pretty different direction if you go back in time. That didn't happen. We see the backlash form, and then you have this more militant kind of masculinity, the Driscoll type in its extreme form. The truth is, the vast majority of people who were reading these books on rugged Christian manhood they're still wearing khakis and polo shirts in their men's group in their suburban churches. They might go out and try to, do rock climbing on the weekend with their men's group. But, otherwise it's not that they're all living this life, but it is being held up as an ideal of what the alpha male actually looks like. And many of these men know that they are not that alpha male. But therefore they give their loyalty or support to the men who are, like the ones who are brave enough, who are strong enough. So then when you get to the hipster mega pastors, it depends on how successful they are. I mean, it becomes a kind of joke, but hey, a lot of these guys are overseeing these pretty big mega churches, millions of dollars of annual budget, and they're stars and they're celebrities. And so power can take different shapes. You get somebody like Donald Trump, right? I mean, he's not William Wallace in physical form. He's
a
not,
very nice way of putting it.
A lot of people are like, oh, come on, no, Donald Trump is not. But then let's talk about power. Let's talk about power. And that can take different shapes. And power in terms of his business, quote unquote, success. Power in terms of his ruthlessness, in terms that he does not care, right? Civility, political correctness, democratic norms, none of that matters. And there's something to be admired there. So really it's a book about power.
It's like Jesus and John Mulaney is the next chapter somehow. Yeah. One critic that I saw, they said about your book that, here's this historian at a premier Christian academic institution, but their claim was you're painting lower or middle class white men whose children have diminishing prospects in the worst possible light, as if you're unfairly picking on guys who are struggling, as if they're the power brokers and not the victims of some other type of circumstance.
Oh, no, I would say this is largely a phenomenon of the white middle class and upper middle class suburban, right? This is a fantasy. It's an ideal. But the shape that this fantasy takes ends up really elevating an idealized version of white working class culture. But it is an idealized version. So there, again, kind of survey data bears this out, and this is a fantasy. And the people who are producing and consuming this literature are, these are guys in suburban churches, in their book clubs and stuff. You have I will say that, I don't know if it came out in that critique, but I think the most valid critique of my book is that I don't do enough of an economic analysis. And there are reasons that I dodged that. And it's not because it wouldn't support the thesis, actually, as I was so up against word count and up against what I feared were the limits of my audience's attention. Because to do a really good economic analysis of this, I'd have to spend a significant amount of time in the 1930s, actually, which is before the book really picks up. And I wasn't sure if I could trust my readers to stay with me. It's a trade book. To look at conservative Protestant opposition to the New Deal, to New Deal politics, that positions them in a particular way in the Cold War era, and that persists, all the way up to today. This that we're seeing, you'd have to bring in prosperity gospel teachings and the embrace of that, which means that, again, this is not purely a working class phenomenon. This prosperity gospel reaches across, all of which is to say there is a lot more to be said. That's a valid critique. I could have done a lot more. I couldn't fit it in the time that I had to get it out before the election, but I really do hope to make up for that in my next book, which really focuses on the economic aspect and, in fact, analyzes this white Christian women's culture in terms of neoliberalism and post-feminism.
One last question for you. This is, again, a different critic, by the way. They said you assign too much power and too much blame to white evangelicals. I'm quoting here. In fact, by her account, evangelicals would love to be as powerful as she claims they are. The truth, however, is that the movement is run by aging white men whose time is mostly up. And my favorite part of that critique, they added after that, they quoted Beth Moore, or they mentioned Beth Moore, and they said, this simple blonde Bible teacher, my tongue-in-cheek description, has nearly 1 million followers on Twitter. The divisions don't hold up any longer.
We are at an interesting moment. We are. And I love this question because I have a lot of thoughts on it because I've been, not just historian, but now I'm kind of a participant in this culture, which I was not expecting, when I was writing this book. I move in these spaces. So first, I will say that the decline of, the old guard, we've been hearing that for at least 20 years now, probably more. And yet here we are. And to understand that, James Dobson, is he still so relevant? I don't know. But then you look at these institutions, these organizations, these networks, and you see who really holds sway here. And you've got prominent figures like Beth Moore. Yes, she has 1 million followers on Twitter. How much power does she have to affect change? She has power to shape individuals a significant amount, right? People who are like, what is going on? And then Beth Moore is, she's saying things that are true. I'm not alone. I do not have 1 million followers. I have about 50,000, right? Which is not insignificant. I think I had like 3 before this book came out. So, right, people are finding me now, but somebody came up with a really interesting kind of analysis of my own power in these spaces. They're saying, you have a lot of power now, right? Compared to most. Mm-hmm. But you, unlike somebody certainly like John Piper or anybody in the Gospel Coalition, your followers are largely marginalized people in these spaces, whereas they have followers who are pastors who influence large numbers of people, right, in these spaces. And I think that's really, really important. We have to always bring an informed analysis of power. Now, the internet is absolutely changing things. Social media is changing things. My book has traveled through these new networks, podcast networks, social media, and it's getting into the hands of the people who most need it and who never would have, had access to this, really, wouldn't have crossed their paths. So that is all real and true. It is changing the power dynamics. And at the same time, I see a whole lot of change when we look at individuals walking away, challenging, standing up. When I look at institutions, nonprofits, Christian schools, Christian universities, mega churches, you name it, that's where you're going to see these individuals are being picked off. They are standing up. They are speaking against. They're thinking in good faith. Hey, let's look at the scriptures here. Let's talk about this. Let's change our curriculum. Let's address this from the pulpit. Let's do that. And one after another, what happens is conservative donors hold an incredible amount of power. Conservative constituents do. And I have so many stories coming my way. Local churches, Christian colleges, right? That there are people who are trying to change, to reform. They are being picked off, or they're getting exhausted, burned out, and they realize they cannot change these power structures. And I'll say I do participate in this world a little bit. I live here in West Michigan. I've been brought in a couple of these situations, like, oh, surely Kristin can make something happen here. Nope, I fail. Just as much as anybody. I just understand why and what we're up against.
I always find it interesting when they say evangelicals would love to be as powerful as she claims they are, because it's like, who exactly do you want to trade places with? Because like, if you want to swap out the number of evangelical claiming politicians for the number of like atheist I'll gladly make that trade. I'm sure Jews and Muslims and everyone else would too. So it's the people with the power complaining they never have enough. Yeah. The book is Jesus and John Wayne. The author is Kristin Du Mez. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for this conversation. It was great.